Thank you very much. Appreciate it's the end of a long day, so I'll try and keep my presentation short. If I skip over a few slides, it's for time reasons to allow a bit of discussion at the end. I should also make a confession. I think I'm very much in the minority in this room, in that I don't have a scientific or medical background at all. In fact, my experience is rather in the area of communications and political sciences, so you won't get from me a detailed scientific presentation, but when we look at this question and when we're considering the question of the panel in general, I hope at least some of my experience qualifies me to talk about that. So, without further ado, I'll start with a very brief overview of what we do at EFSA, who we are, where we come from. I'll then focus on a specific issue that we've been dealing with over the last 3 or 4 years, which is the pesticide active substance glyphosate. I'll introduce a little bit of research that we've done on reputation, the reputation of our agency, and then finish with some general conclusions. So, EFSA, who are we? Well, we're an European agency. We're based in Parma, the European Food Safety Authority. And we came into being in 2002 with the introduction of the General Food Law. And it followed, at the time, followed a series of food crises, the most notable example of which was BSE. And there was a feeling that something needed to be done to improve the EU food safety system, to restore confidence, consumer confidence and citizen confidence in the EU food supply chain. And at the center of this was the principle that the assessment of scientific risk, or the scientific assessment of risk related to food, and decisions taken about those risks should be separated in the process. So we had this clear separation between scientific risk assessment, which at the European level is done by EFSA, and and risk management, which is rather a decision taken by the European Commission, member state governments, and the European Parliament. So as I said, our role is to provide independent scientific advice. We do this to support EU risk managers in the decisions that they have to take about food and feed safety, food and feed risks. We also have a mandate for risk communication. And essentially by that we mean explaining, communicating about the outcome of the scientific risk assessment that we do. And we also have a role in promoting scientific cooperation both within the EU, so we work very closely with food safety organizations at a national level. In France, for example, that would be ANSES, but also with our peer organizations around the world. As important as what EFSA does do is what EFSA does not do. And when we think about this question, mixing science and policy, or science and politics, this is fundamental for us. And by way of example, we, as you can imagine, we have a fairly active press office at EFSA. We receive many hundreds of queries from the media every year, questions, requests for information, requests for comments on certain issues, requests for interviews, and so on. And by our estimation, about 50% of those requests fundamentally misunderstand our role. So we might receive a question like, why did EFSA approve this pesticide? Or when will EFSA update the legislation on X, Y, and Z? And in fact, as this slide shows, we have no role and no authority, no power to develop food safety policies and legislation. We don't adopt regulations, and we don't authorize products in the EU, and nor do we enforce food safety legislation. But already you can see, or we experience, in our experience, this misunderstanding of the role, the separation between risk assessment and risk management can lead to problems further down the line. And the way we work is in scientific panels, and you can see we cover the whole gamut of food and feed safety issues. The panels, committees essentially, are made up of member state experts that come from across Europe, again from competent authorities, national food safety authorities, universities, and so on. And the work is more or less divided into two separate areas. So you have the general risk assessment, which includes activities on biological hazards, chemical contaminants, animal health and welfare, plant health. And then the work that we do on regulated products. And here you can include GMOs, pesticides, food additives, food packaging materials, and so on. So the model that was put in place in 2002, I think by and large and by most objective standards, we can say that this model has worked. It's proved to be resilient. I mean, if we think about food safety in the EU, it's not by coincidence that we have safe food in the EU. That the system we have in place is highly sophisticated. It involves many different organizations, partners, and experts, and EFSA also has a crucial role to play in this. It's not a coincidence that the EU is a region that exports billions and billions of euros worth of food every year outside the EU. The reason why we have such high volumes of trade in fruit and food commodities is because the people that receive this food in different parts of the world understand fundamentally that the food will be safe. Nevertheless, despite the fact that we have what I would say in essence is a strong system for food safety, it doesn't prevent organizations like EFSA from receiving criticism. And invariably this criticism is related to the work we do on regulated products. In the past it used to be GMOs. Now the focus is mainly on pesticides and endocrine disruptors also features as well in some of the criticism we receive. And at times this criticism reaches such a level of intensity that it really can have an effect on our reputation. And to explore this a little bit further, I will focus now on the case of glyphosate. Being in France, I presume that the majority of people in this room have heard of glyphosate. It's a pesticide active substance, it's been authorized on the EU market for a while. There was an approval given in 2002, a license for 10 years. In 2012, as is the normal way with pesticide active substances, the renewal assessment was submitted by the manufacturers that wanted to continue to market this product in the EU. And that is the point at which EFSA and member states came into action, if you like. That's where the story of glyphosate began for us. The way it works with risk assessment for pesticide active substances in Europe is that a draft assessment in the first instance is carried out by an individual member state. So in the case of glyphosate, it was Germany. And then experts from all the other member states and EFSA carry out a peer review on the draft assessment. In a sense, we work to improve the draft assessment done by the original member state, and then EFSA takes a final decision. And in the case of glyphosate, we published our final conclusion in 2015. And the finding that sparked the controversy that followed is the the conclusion we made in relation to the carcinogenic potential or threat of glyphosate to humans. And we concluded that glyphosate does not pose a carcinogenic threat to humans. And the reason this sparked a controversy is because 6 months prior to the publication of our opinion, the International Agency for Research and Cancer published its own assessment, its own classification of glyphosate, in which it deemed it to be probably carcinogenic. So we had a scientific divergence. And I'm not qualified to stand here in front of you and argue the science about the divergence. What I can say, though, is that it's not uncommon for EFSA, but it's not uncommon in science in general for divergence to exist. It can happen between individual scientists working on a single topic. It can happen between scientific organizations, particularly if the evidence you're looking at is different. The methodologies you use to appraise that evidence is different, and the experts you use to carry out the assessment are different. And that, in essence, is at the heart of the divergence between EFSA and IARC. Different evidence base, different methodologies used to appraise the evidence, and different experts. I would also say, just as an aside, it's not the first time EFSA has had a divergence with IARC. Altogether, we've assessed, both of our organisations have assessed approximately 50 substances, 50 of the same substances. In some cases, EFSA produces an assessment which is, if you like, in inverted commas, stricter than that of, or more conservative than that of IARC. In other cases, it's the other way around, and in some cases, we agree. Interestingly, the only scientific divergence you hear about is the one with glyphosate. I would also mention that EFSA's assessment of the carcinogenicity of glyphosate was agreed with by a number of other agencies in jurisdictions around the world. So very soon after, and coming back to the topic at hand, very soon after we published our opinion on glyphosate, the debate moved from a scientific environment into one which included many different factors, into a political setting. So the first month or so, we saw a focus in reporting on the scientific divergence, but it quickly escalated. And between 2015 and now, really the intensity of the debate, the public debate, the political debate, the media debate, has been like nothing, at least for EFSA, that we have seen before. You mentioned that endocrine disruptors featured in the presidential campaign in France. The same was true with glyphosate. It also featured in recent discussions when they were trying to form a coalition in Germany. So it really, I mean, it crossed the desk of the most powerful people in Europe, if you like, at a political level. And at this stage, you know, EFSA, whatever we say and whatever we do to try and communicate about our work, to try and explain a scientific divergence, is essentially lost. You know, there are so many interested parties and so many factors at play. I won't dwell on these slides here, but these are the kind of headlines you can see here. I mean, this is obviously just a snapshot, but what you don't see here is a discussion about the science. What you do see here is a discussion about the role of multinationals, about lobbying, words like whitewash, court cases. And the pressure grew, the intensity of the campaign against glyphosate was so strong that we have seen court cases, we've seen citizens' initiatives, petitions which have gathered millions of signatures. And it's led now to, although glyphosate was renewed eventually after 2 years, after many delays and a lot of political wrangling, glyphosate was renewed for 5 years. The campaign here that was led by the environmental NGOs and others has led to a serious discussion among legislators and policymakers about the system that we want for agriculture, for sustainable agriculture in the EU. And it has also led to a concrete proposal from the European Commission to change the general food law, and that is being debated as we speak between the European Parliament and the Council. Coming back to, if you like, our role briefly with glyphosate, our gut instinct was, and on the left-hand side here you see some examples of the types of allegations that crop up that we've had to deal with regards to glyphosate. And on the right-hand side, if you like, the facts. And our instinct, and I think majority of us would, well, I hope you would feel some sympathy for this, is, you know, if you're presented with something which you know is untrue, and you have information which you know is true, your instinct is to share that information, to present that information, and hope that the person who receives it at the other end changes their mind. It's not always the case. It doesn't work like that. And you know, as scientists, as a scientific organization, you know, we're used to dealing with, if you like, evidence, with facts, whatever they may be. And we tend to communicate in that way. So, we're very careful about the words that we choose. We try and be as accurate as possible. We try and reflect the science in the way that we communicate as accurately as possible. But when you are, if you like, putting that communication in a sphere or an environment which is extremely emotional and highly charged with lots of stakeholders and opinions and vested interests and all the rest of it, essentially that message becomes lost. So here, I won't go through them all, but just to look at the first one. One of the criticisms that we received is that EFSA, our assessment essentially of glyphosate is flawed because we decided that we decided to base our assessment on industry studies, and therefore everything is inherently biased. And behind that, there are many different layers to that allegation. The first thing to point out is EFSA hasn't decided anything here. The burden that industry assumes to pay for and carry out safety studies is set out clearly in legislation. And this is legislation that has been adopted by the European Parliament and the Council. So, it's not EFSA that is deciding or choosing to use industry studies versus so-called independent studies or whatever it may be. And there are other examples here on transparency and to do with independence and so on and so forth. This, if you like, this is really a snapshot of the type of thing that we've had to deal with. But it made us question really our reputation and whether or not, because there was so much negative coverage, should we be questioning, should we be looking at our own reputation, making sure that what we say and that what we do enhances our reputation. So we decided to carry out some research of our own. We developed a pilot study. It's the first of its kind as far as we're aware, so it's certainly among European agencies or risk assessment bodies. And we wanted to measure our reputation in the eyes of our key stakeholders, so the European Commission, the member states, industry, NGOs, civil society, the scientific community, and also with European parliamentarians. So we designed a quantitative and a qualitative research study, and essentially what we're trying to do is measure EFSA's reputation against different attributes. And they're listed here. I won't go through them all, but it's things like the quality of our risk assessments, the efficiency of our risk assessments, how well we engage with stakeholders, and issues as well about independence, objectivity, and transparency. And what we wanted to create, and what we did in the end, was come up with a score, so a single figure for each of the groups on a scale of -100 to +100. And you can see here the overall results. Bear in mind this was done in 2017, in the middle of the glyphosate controversy. Also, bear in mind it's on a scale from -100 to +100. So here you see, after we put all the information together, the feedback from all the surveys we did and the interviews we carried out, and put it through our methodology, these are the figures that we came up with. And you can see from the left-hand side, member state authorities, national food safety agencies and so on, gave us a score of 46 for our reputation, the European Commission 33, industry 20, consumer and environmental NGOs 3, and the scientific community 42. Now, for us, that was reassuring, because we were coming from a very, if you like, low place, or at least we felt the perception we had was that the reputation of EFSA was suffering. But when we put the question to our key stakeholders, the response we got was actually reassuring. The worst result, or the least favorable result, comes from consumer and environmental NGOs, and the score there is still above, if you like, neutral. If you focus on two factors for independence and transparency, the figures are more or less similar, except we see a slight dip with consumers and environmental NGOs. But we would say that falls, broadly speaking, within the range that we would expect. If you consider 0 is in the middle, then a small deviation, -4, -11, doesn't overly concern us. If you'd like to see more about this study, you can find it on our website, or I'd be happy to provide you with the link afterwards. So what can, and a couple more slides, what can EFSA do to improve trust, or what can we all do to improve trust in the EU food safety system? I would say, to start with, and obviously picking up from the research that we did, but also going back to what I said earlier, I think, we should be clear, we should have confidence that the EFSA and the food safety system in general is fundamentally it works well. Citizens and risk managers can have faith in the scientific advice provided by EFSA. Having said that, no system is perfect, and if the glyphosate controversy taught us anything, it is that there is room for improvement. There are things that EFSA can do, and I've listed them here, but then there are things I think that we as a scientific community or others can do as well. So for EFSA, it means engaging more in a more meaningful way with our stakeholders. We really need to understand, what it is that motivates them, what it is that we can do to, if you like, accommodate their needs. There is also a growing pressure on transparency. I think EFSA really leads the way when it comes to transparency. You can find so much information about the work that we do on our website, but it's not enough, or the message we get is that it's not enough. And so we will continue to invest in making the evidence, the methodologies that we use transparent and available to all on our website. I think, and this is particularly relevant for communications, we need a better understanding of risk perception and societal concerns. And there, as an organization, we've recently invested in social science. I think social science has a lot to teach us about, how consumers perceive risks and how our messages are received by consumers. And that will help us deliver more meaningful communications. And the other thing we need to bear in mind that facts are not enough. Science must also connect on in an emotional level. You can all, I'm sure, think of scientific celebrities. You may have different opinions on them. They exist in France, they exist in the UK, where I'm from, they exist all over the place. But there's something about these scientific celebrities who have found a way to connect with the man on the street or the woman on the street. And we have to, I think, as a scientific community, understand that it's not always enough just to communicate the facts. We have to find a way of delivering that message as well, which can be received by different audiences. And we have to be better at explaining scientific divergence. If we had been able to resolve the divergence with IAC at an early stage, I think the picture with glyphosate would have been very different. And the final slide, where I think support is needed from others. EFSA is a scientific organization, so if we're talking about the mix between science and policy, we are not equipped to argue for or against big societal issues. The role of multinational organizations in agri-food business, the type of agriculture we want as a society. These are political issues or societal issues that should be discussed in different fora. We will support that debate in any way that we can, but we are not equipped to answer those questions, and nor should we be expected to. And for that reason, I think when it comes to when we talk about policymakers and legislators, they should make very clear when they're basing the information, or when they're basing their decisions on science, and when they're basing their decisions on other factors, be they social factors, economic factors, ethical concerns, whatever it may be. Too often we find that if a scientific activity or a scientific advice that we provide does not meet with the political agenda of a policymaker or a legislator, both at a European and national level, the tendency is to look at the science and criticize the science as opposed to say, okay, I don't necessarily like the advice that you give, or I don't necessarily like the conclusion you've arrived at, but I trust the process, and the decision we make is going to be based on a different, we're taking this decision because we think from an economic point of view it's more important, or from a societal point of view, we have concerns and we want to go in a different direction. That would help keep this separation between risk assessment and risk management clear. And finally, there is we witness, not only with glyphosate, with pesticides, with GMOs, and with other areas. There's a tendency by campaign organizations and some policymakers and legislators to pick and choose which issues or advice that we produce to campaign against. And we might find ourselves in a situation where one day we are receiving praise from an environmental NGO for the work we do, for example, on neonicotinoids, pesticides, neonicotinoids, and from the same organization the next day criticizing about the work that we do on glyphosate, even though we've used essentially the same experts, the same methodological approach, and in many cases the same type of evidence. And that kind of approach, that cherry-picking approach, in the long term, it erodes trust, because there will be a day, there may be a day when society in general, policymakers, legislators will need to rely on EFSA in a crisis situation. And then it is important that the advice that we give, the communication that we make is trusted. So with that, I close, and thank you very much.